You're probably coming here to see what's going on with patch 7 for Baldur's Gate 3. This is the very anticipated patch that's going to be adding tons of content directed towards those truly evil players that are looking for a more satisfying ending to the game. This is also the long-awaited patch that's going to be bringing true mod support to the game, and it's the patch I've personally been waiting for to do a full 100% playthrough of. Well, I'm pleased to say you guys are not going to have to wait long. We're going to be getting into the details of patch 7 later in the video, but for now I just want to talk about the PAX West panel that was aired last week because I think there's some really interesting takeaways from it. Specifically, I think there's some evidence in this panel that leads me to believe that there's actually some bad blood between Larian Studios and Wizards of the Coast. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's actually get into the panel and just talk about what was said here. So this panel was hosted a full year after the release of Baldur's Gate 3 once it got out of early access, and it was kind of a way for the developers to offer a retrospective on their development cycle and just their journey of creating the game. In this panel, they talked about a lot of really interesting stuff and provided a ton of insight into the development process of Baldur's Gate 3. They talked about the struggles of early access and how the game was changed drastically from its duration, and how people actually really did not like the very early stages of the game, and a lot of people actually said that it was kind of a Divinity Original Sin 2 clone, so that kind of prompted Larian to do a drastic overhaul in the very early stages. Larian tested tons of different concepts for the game, and one of them that obviously didn't make it to the finish line was a first-person mode for cinematics. They said that in the very early stages, they tried to mess around with a first-person mode for the cinematics in the game, but they said that very early on, they realized that it just did not work, and it kind of left me scratching my head thinking like, man, what would that be like? And as we move along, be sure to leave a mental note of this one because I think this is actually going to be a really good clue as to what they might be working on next. Something that I thought was really interesting was they talked about just the process of implementing the D&D 5e rule set into the game and how it just provided them a ton of challenge, and it was a very huge hurdle for them to overcome. They said that they needed to get very creative in the ways of implementation, and there's clearly tons of spells and abilities or just stuff from D&D that never made it into the game because they would just be virtually impossible to scale into a video game. For example, they mentioned Divine Intervention and just kind of talked about how the implications of that spell in D&D, it's, you could literally ask for anything, and how exactly do you implement that into a video game? So they said they had some really hard challenges to overcome, especially for stuff like that. Of course, we have to talk about the bear scene, because the bear has basically become a meme, especially with the studio, and I mean, they literally had a bear at the panel, which is kind of funny. So they actually shared a lot about the bear scene and how it was concepted, and how the reaction was for the people in the studio. They talked about how they were actually pretty nervous about implementing it into the game, but they said that the players' reception from the scene was overwhelmingly positive, and it was just kind of like a way to show like, yeah, this is how like in-depth this game is and just how crazy it can be. And they said that that scene in particular was basically a way that the team wanted to emphasize humor and creativity, and that's kind of how they ended up with that scene itself. And whether you liked it or hated it, that scene itself became basically a viral moment and basically significantly boosted the game's visibility, and was kind of a turning point for the company because once that scene was showed off, the game was talked about by everybody. They also talked about how the company grew in the development of Baldur's Gate 3, and they said that they initially started with 100 members and went all the way up to 400 during its development cycle. Now, it's worth mentioning, not all 400 people are all crammed into one studio. They're spread across multiple smaller studios across the globe. And one thing that I think Larian Studios does really well, and I think a lot of other studios should do this in the future, and that is having a studio in every single time zone. And what this does is it basically means that the development of a game literally never stops. 24/7, someone is always working on a game. When one studio is, sleeping, a studio across the world is working on it. And they basically just, take turns sharing their progress to the next studio, and it just keeps going like that. And coincidentally, this actually helps combat crunch. So your developers are not going to have to be forced to do all-nighters. But overall, it was kind of a sad panel in a way, because this is basically the last panel they were having on Baldur's Gate 3, and they kind of just talked about how the development for that game is over and they're going to be moving on to the new thing. They also had a brief Q&A section where they had members of the crowd come up and ask them questions, and there were two questions in particular that I wanted to talk about here. So this is going to be the first one. I'm just going to let this play out.
I was having an argument with a friend recently, and he asked me why the sexuality in Baldur's Gate is acclaimed and beloved, while the sexuality in other games like Stellar Blade is sometimes seen by some people as controversial or distasteful. And I knew that Baldur's Gate 3 does it wonderfully, but I couldn't articulate a good response to him as to why. So I'm wondering what you did to differentiate how sexuality was portrayed in your game as opposed to how it is in other games.
You want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we wanted to present people that felt authentic. So whether it was their sexuality, parts of their identity, their traumas, we wanted them to feel authentic. And I think when they feel authentic and they feel like diverse people with different problems, different attitudes, and different kinks, arousals, fetishes, whatever it might be, seriously, I mean, I think if they feel authentic, then people embrace them as authentic people and characters. I don't think sexuality should be controversial. I think that it's okay for things to be sexy. And I think there's a broad range of what that can mean, and I think that's fine. I mean, like, there's nothing wrong with cheesecake, and there's nothing wrong with the more authentic version. But for us, it was we present them as people, and then hopefully you go along. I was going to say on the ride with them, but you go along on the journey with them, and you're having an adventure with them. Thank you. And you develop a relationship, and then hopefully it feels natural.
So that's Adam. He is the writer/director at Larian Studios, and I gotta say, he answered this question beautifully. This was such a great answer and a really good mindset to have that I really wish more developers had, because I feel like nowadays there's basically a war against sexuality, especially in video games, and there's definitely been a push in the industry to make characters deliberately ugly. I don't know why, it's really weird, but it's definitely something that's happening.
You made it? Yeah, what is this? Fable IRL actors compared to in-game model? Oh god. Jesus fucking Christ.
And I thought it was just worth pointing this out, but yeah, we definitely need more companies and studios like Larian to be more open about this and just, go against the grain, because at the end of the day, if you're making a video game, you should be able to make the characters in your game look however you want them to look without having people freak out about it. But I will say, I think it is worth mentioning that the way Larian Studios did it, where, basically they make the characters believable and they try to approach sexuality and just, all that stuff in a very genuine way, definitely speaks to people. And I think that's probably the way to go. And then I mentioned at the start of this video that I think there is some bad blood between Larian Studios and Wizards of the Coast, and it's because of this question here. Pay close attention to how Sven answers it.
Hi. Hi. I'm in love with the characters and their stories, and I was wondering if y'all are open to or have plans to expand or continue their stories in the form of a book or graphic novels.
No. No, and the answer to that is that those rights lie with Wizards of the Coast now when it comes to books and graphic novels. So that's a question for them.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
I don't think they're here.
Now, one could say that the way he's responding to this is just basically he just wants to put an end to the Baldur's Gate story and move on to something else. But in my opinion, I think there's more to it. Now, back in March, there was actually a ton of speculation as to why Larian Studios was not making a Baldur's Gate 3 expansion or Baldur's Gate 4. And a lot of people were talking about how they think there was a huge, fight between Wizards of the Coast and Larian Studios. And there was so much talk that Sven actually put out a post on Twitter about it, and this is what he said. Reading the Reddit threads, I would like to clear up something. Wizards of the Coast is not to blame for us taking a different direction. On the contrary, they really did their best at having a great license for us, letting us do our thing. This is because it's what's best for Larian. Now, in my opinion, this is what we call a political answer. Of course, the CEO of Larian Studios is not going to blast Wizards of the Coast publicly. That would be a terrible idea. There is a 99.99999% chance we're never going to see or hear the conversation that happened behind closed doors. All we can do is sit and speculate. But I gotta say, in my opinion, his reaction to that question, I felt something there. That was genuine frustration. And judging by some of the things that are happening over at Wizards of the Coast and all the weird shit that they're doing with their IP, my guess is that Wizards of the Coast probably wanted Larian Studios to adhere to their new company policies and structures for the game and IP, and Larian Studios probably told them to pound sand. One thing I want to say before we get into the details of patch 7 is if you guys are enjoying this video so far, please let me know by subscribing to my channel. Over here I cover World of Warcraft and other games like Baldur's Gate 3, so chances are there is something on my channel that you guys will probably like. I release videos every week, so there's always something for you guys to look forward to. Moving on to patch 7. So during this panel, they said that the release date for patch 7 is going to be out next week. So there's probably a really good chance that by the time you guys watch this video, the patch is probably going to be out. Some of the big things that are coming out in patch 7 is going to be the introduction of evil endings, which is basically a brand new list of cinematic endings for anyone that played a truly evil character. They're going to be adding their very own mod manager, which is basically going to let you browse, install, and use mods created by the community. This is going to drastically improve the quality of modded content for the game. Now, this is not something like Witcher 3 or Cyberpunk 2077, where you've got like a giant map editor kind of thing, but I do think it's going to be a lot easier for people to get their stuff out there. They're also going to be making honor mode a lot harder than it is right now. They're adding a ton of new legendary actions to different characters, so definitely watch out for that. There's also a really big update for split screen gameplay out there. So basically, when a player is playing on a split screen with another person, the two halves of the screen will now dynamically merge together when the players get close to each other. So that way you guys will be able to, go out and explore in different ways. And when you get next to each other, the screen's going to just look the same. So that's a really cool addition. And unfortunately, I don't have anyone to play split screen with, but that does sound like a really cool feature for those of you that want to try it out. There's also a ton of bug changes and a bunch of other minor things that are happening with this patch that I really don't want to bore you guys with reading everything from. So now that we have the details of patch 7 and we know what happened at the panel for PAX West, let me know what you guys think in the comments section. I love to hear your thoughts, and I always try my best to respond to everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to watch my video. I'm still Solo, and I'll see you guys in the next one.